It's noon in Thebes. It's 1350 BCE and it is conservatively 43 degrees C, that's 110 degrees F for the Americans in the audience. There is no air conditioning. There is no ice. There is no cold drink of any kind anywhere on the planet because refrigeration will not be invented for another 3,000 years. You are standing on sand that is hot enough to cook an egg on in a country that is 95% desert, wearing a linen kilt, and you are about to go do manual labor and you're fine. Not fine as in miserable and coping. Fine as in this is a normal Tuesday. Fine as in you will do this again tomorrow and the day after and you will live to be 60, which for the ancient world is the oldest anyone lives. Now here's what I want you to sit with. We look at ancient Egypt and we see the pyramids. We see gold masks and mummies and Tutankhamun's face on a museum poster. What we never see is the boring, relentless daily engineering problem sitting underneath all of it. How do you keep several million people alive, working and not dying of heat stroke in one of the hottest inhabited places on Earth for 3,000 years with no electricity? Because that's the actual achievement. Anybody can build a big triangle if they've got enough rocks and enough time, but keeping the workforce alive long enough to finish it, that's the hard part. So today we're going through all of it. The architecture, the clothing, the beer, the salt, the wind catchers, the doctors, the beard situation. And by the end you're going to realize something slightly uncomfortable. The Egyptians solved this problem so well that we've spent the last century solving it worse, just with more electricity. Let's go. The thing nobody tells you about Egypt. Here's the misconception baked into the question itself. We picture ancient Egyptians enduring the heat, suffering through it, grimly surviving, like the desert was an enemy they held off by sheer willpower and stubbornness. That's wrong, and it's wrong in an interesting way. The Egyptians weren't surviving the desert. They were living in a very narrow green ribbon next to the desert, and they had spent thousands of years engineering that ribbon so thoroughly that the heat became a design parameter rather than a threat. Every single thing about Egyptian daily life, the shape of the houses, the fabric of the clothes, the timing of the workday, what you drank when you ate, which direction your bed faced, all of it had been quietly optimized over dozens of generations to deal with one specific problem. They weren't fighting the sun. They'd made peace with it and then read the fine print very carefully. And to understand how, we need to talk about the least glamorous topic in Egyptology, sweat. You are a walking evaporation machine. Your body has exactly one serious cooling strategy, and it's water. When you get hot, you push water through your skin, and when that water evaporates, it carries heat away with it. That's it. That's the whole system. Dogs pant. Elephants use their ears as radiators. Pigs roll in mud because they can barely sweat at all. Humans have somewhere between 2 and 4 million sweat glands, and we are genuinely the best sweaters in the animal kingdom. The catch is that the system runs on a consumable. You are cooling yourself by spending water, and in the Egyptian summer you spend it fast. A laborer working outdoors in that climate can lose several liters a day, lose 2% of your body weight in fluid, and your cognitive performance drops measurably. Lose 5 and you're in real trouble. Lose 10 and you're dying confused because one of the first things heat takes from you is your ability to notice that anything's wrong. There's a second consumable too, and this one gets forgot. Sweat isn't distilled water. It's salty. Sweat hard enough and you can drink all the water in the world and still crash because you flushed out the sodium your nervous system needs to function. That's hyponatremia, and it will kill you just as dead as dehydration, with the added indignity that you'll have a full water jar in your hand when it happens. So the survival equation in ancient Egypt comes down to 3 things: reduce heat load, replace water, replace salt. Everything that follows is just increasingly clever versions of those 3 moves. Move 1, the building is the air conditioner. Start with the house because this is where the Egyptians were quietly brilliant. Egyptian domestic architecture was mud brick, Nile silt mixed with chopped straw packed into molds baked hard in the very sun it was designed to defeat. There's a nice irony in that, and mud brick has a property that modern building materials have spent decades trying to get back: enormous thermal mass. Here's what that means in practice. A thick mud brick wall doesn't block heat, it delays it. Sun hits the wall all day and the heat crawls through the material slowly, taking hours to make the journey. So the peak heat of the afternoon arrives inside your house around midnight, by which time the desert night has gone cold and you actually want it. Then the cold of the night crawls through and arrives inside at midday when you're desperate for it. The wall isn't insulation, it's a time machine for temperature. It takes the daily swing, which in the Egyptian desert can be 20 degrees C between noon and dawn, and flips it exactly out of phase with your needs. Nobody in 1350 BCE was writing equations about thermal lag. They just noticed that thick walls made the house better and thin walls made it worse, and they built accordingly for 3,000 years. Then they stacked more tricks on top. Windows were small and set high near the ceiling because hot air rises and you want the exit near the top. Walls were whitewashed, which reflects a substantial portion of incoming solar radiation rather than absorbing it. Streets in worker settlements like Deir el-Medina, the village that housed the craftsmen who cut the royal tombs, were narrow, which meant the buildings shaded each other for most of the day. Rooms were arranged so the ones you used in the afternoon sat on the shaded side. And then there's the roof. Egyptian roofs were flat, and the flat roof was a functional living space. You slept up there. In the hot months, a huge portion of the population simply moved their bed to the roof at night, where the air moved and heat radiated away into a cloudless sky. Sleeping on the roof in an Egyptian summer isn't poverty. It's the premium suite. Move 2, the wind catcher. Now here's where it gets interesting. Egyptian houses had a feature called a Malkaf. You'll see them depicted in tomb paintings. Most famously in the tomb of Nebamun at Thebes, dating to around 1300 BCE, which shows a structure on a roof that is unmistakably a wind scoop. The Malkaf is a hooded vent built on the roof, angled to face the prevailing wind in Egypt reliably out of the north. Wind hits the scoop, gets funneled down a shaft, and is delivered directly into the living space below. Meanwhile, hot air, being hot, is rising and escaping through those high windows on the other side. You've created a pressure difference. You've built a chimney that runs sideways. That's passive ventilation. No moving parts and no power source. It works because wind exists and heat rises, and both of those things are going to keep being true forever. And the Egyptians took it one step further, which is the part that makes me slightly emotional. Some households would place porous clay water jars in the path of that incoming air. Water seeps through the clay, evaporates off the outer surface, and evaporation takes heat with it. The air arriving in your room has now been cooled by passing over an evaporating surface. That's an evaporative cooler. That's a swamp cooler. That is in principle the exact same machine you can buy today at a hardware store for $200 running on electricity, and they built it out of a pot and a hole in the roof. This design didn't die with Egypt, by the way. Wind catchers spread and evolved across the Middle East and Persia into the towering badgirs of Yazd in Iran, some of which still stand and still work. The technology never actually stopped being good. We just got access to cheap electricity and decided we'd rather solve the problem by burning things. Move 3, linen, and why covering up beats stripping off. Let's talk about clothes. Your instinct in extreme heat is to wear as little as possible. The Egyptian answer was more nuanced than that, and the nuance is the interesting part. Egyptian clothing was almost universally linen, made from flax, and the reason is a stack of material properties that happen to line up perfectly with the problem. Linen is highly breathable. The fibers are hollow, so air moves through the weave. It's exceptionally good at wicking, meaning it pulls sweat off your skin and spreads it across a wide surface where it can evaporate efficiently. And it's a poor insulator, so it doesn't trap the heat you're trying to lose. Cotton, for comparison, holds moisture against the skin. Wool insulates. Linen does neither. In that specific climate, it is close to the ideal fabric, and the Egyptians figured that out early enough that flax cultivation became one of the foundational industries of the entire civilization. There's also a quality gradient here that tells you everything about Egyptian society. The finest linen, sometimes called royal linen, was woven so finely that surviving fragments are nearly transparent, and producing it took skilled weavers enormous amounts of time. Elites wore that. Field laborers wore coarse, thick linen or a simple kilt, or in a lot of cases very little at all. Same climate, same material, radically different experience of it. That gap runs through this entire story, and we'll come to it. And then the counterintuitive bit, loose, light-colored cloth over your skin can keep you cooler than bare skin because it blocks direct solar radiation while still letting sweat evaporate. You lose a little airflow, you gain a lot of shade. It's the same reason desert peoples across North Africa and Arabia converged on flowing robes rather than shorts. Being naked in the desert sun isn't freedom, it's just faster sunburn, which brings us to hair. Egyptians, particularly the wealthy, frequently shaved their heads and wore wigs. This looks purely like fashion, and partly it was about lice, which nobody enjoys. But a wig sits slightly off the scalp, creating a ventilated air gap, and it can be removed. Your actual hair cannot. Shave the head and you've got a surface you can wash, cool, and cover on demand. The Egyptians were also famously obsessive about cleanliness and oils. Priests bathed multiple times daily. Ordinary people used scented fats and oils on the skin, which protected against sun damage and cracking in extremely dry air. Herodotus, visiting centuries later, noted the Egyptian preoccupation with washing with a slight tone of bewilderment, which is very funny coming from a Greek. Move 4. Drink beer seriously. Here's the fluid problem. You need several liters of water a day. The Nile is right there. The Nile is also full of parasites, silt, animal waste, human waste, and depending on the season and how far upstream the last village was, things you do not want to think about while drinking. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease spread through freshwater snails, has been detected in Egyptian mummies. Drinking straight from the river was not free, so Egyptians drank beer, vast structural civilization scale amounts of beer. And I need to be clear about what this beer was because it wasn't a pint. Egyptian beer was thick, low in alcohol, made from barley or emmer wheat, often strained but still substantial enough that some descriptions put it closer to gruel than a drink. It was food. It was hydration, it was calories, it carried B vitamins from the yeast. Crucially, the brewing process involved heating the mash, and the fermentation itself produces an environment that's hostile to a lot of pathogens. Beer was, for practical purposes, safer than the river it came from. How structural was this? Workers were paid the records from el-Medina, one of the best documented workforces in the entire ancient world, because these people wrote down everything on limestone flakes, including their absences and their complaints. Show rations of bread and beer as standard compensation. Daily allowances of multiple jars per worker appear in the record. And in one of the great moments in labor history, when those workers' rations were delivered late during the reign of Ramesses III, around 1155 BCE, they downed tools and staged what is generally considered the first recorded strike in human history. They walked off the royal necropolis over food and beer. Sitting behind that strike is the thing we established earlier. In that climate, the ration wasn't a perk, it was the cooling system. Cut the beer and you're not being stingy, you're switching off the water supply for men doing heavy labor in a desert. 5. Salt, bread, and the invisible chemistry. Now the part nobody thinks about. You've replaced the water, you have not replaced the salt, and the salt is what stops muscles in your brain from going soft in the afternoon. The Egyptian diet handled this almost by accident. Bread was the staple, coarse, dense, and gritty enough that it visibly wore down the teeth of the population, which we can see in surviving mummies as heavily abraded molars. Salted and dried fish was a common preserved food. Natron, the naturally occurring sodium compound harvested from dried lake beds and famous for its role in mummification, also had domestic uses. Onions, garlic, dates, figs, dates in particular being an efficient package of sugar and potassium. None of this was designed as an electrolyte strategy. Nobody was thinking about sodium ions, but a diet built on salted preserved fish, salted bread, and potassium-rich fruit consumed alongside enormous volumes of low-alcohol beer produces almost exactly the fluid and mineral balance that a person doing heavy outdoor labor in extreme heat requires. That's the pattern that keeps repeating in this story, not knowledge, iteration. A few thousand years of doing the thing that worked and quietly dropping the thing that didn't until the accumulated result looks like it was designed by someone with a physiology textbook. Move 6. Don't be outside. The simplest solution is the one we skipped, so let's do it now. The Egyptian day was structured around the sun rather than against it. Work started before dawn. Heavy labor happened in the cool of early morning. The middle of the day, the genuinely dangerous window, was for rest, shade, food, and sleep. Then work resumed as the sun dropped. el-Medina again gives us the detail because those workers recorded their schedule. They worked in shifts, they had rest days, and during the working period many of them stayed in temporary huts up near the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, rather than walking home across open ground twice a day in the heat. Even the great construction projects appear to have run on seasonal logic. A significant portion of pyramid building labor is thought to have been organized around the annual Nile inundation. When the fields flooded, agricultural work paused and a large labor force became available. And the flood also made it dramatically easier to move stone by boat. The work day, the work year, and the calendar itself all bent around the sun and the river. And they had medicine for when it went wrong anyway. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, is one of the oldest surviving medical texts on Earth, and it contains remedies for fever, for burns, for headache, for a whole catalog of conditions consistent with heat exposure. Some of it is magical incantation. Some of it honey on wounds, which we now know has genuine antibacterial properties, turns out to work. That mixture of the empirical and the mystical side by side, entirely unbothered by the contradiction, is very much the ancient world in general. The twist, the desert, was the point. All right, here's where this whole story turns over. We've been treating the desert as the problem. Everything so far has been Egyptians defending against it, but ancient Egypt existed because of the desert. The Egyptians called the fertile black soil of the floodplain Kemet, the Black Land. They called the desert Deseret, the Red Land. Two names, two worlds, one border you could stand with a foot on each side of. And the Red Land was, functionally, a wall. It's the reason Egypt held a recognizable identity for 3,000 years while civilizations in Mesopotamia were being conquered and reconquered on what feels like a rotating schedule. Egypt was flanked east and west by hundreds of kilometers of lethal, waterless sand. Armies can't cross that. Supply lines can't cross that. The desert was a moat that no one had to build, maintain, or garrison, and it went further than defense. The desert's aridity is the reason we know anything about Egypt at all. Organic material, papyrus, linen, wood, painted plaster, human tissue, rots in humidity and survives in dryness. Every papyrus scroll in every museum, every preserved body, every scrap of painted cloth, exists because the climate that made life difficult made decay nearly impossible. Mummification itself is a technology built directly out of local geology. The Egyptians noticed that bodies buried in hot dry sand naturally desiccated and survived, and the entire elaborate apparatus of embalming was, at bottom, an attempt to reproduce artificially what the desert did for free. Natron, the salt they used to dry the body, came out of desert lake beds, so the heat didn't just get survived, it got recruited, it defended the borders, it dried the dead, it preserved the archive. And it is the single reason a civilization from 3000 BCE is better documented than most of medieval Europe. Here's what I keep coming back to. There is a house in Egypt 3 and 1 2,000 years ago, thick mud walls holding yesterday's cool, a scoop on the roof pulling the north wind down into the rooms, a porous clay jar sitting in the airflow, sweating, taking the heat out of the breeze, a family asleep on the roof under a sky with no clouds in it, a jar of thick beer for the morning. Not one part of that requires electricity, not one part of it will ever break in a way that can't be fixed with mud and hands. It has no off switch because it has no on switch, and it was arrived at not by genius but by several thousand years of people paying close attention to what made the afternoon bearable and passing that on to their kids. We've spent the last 100 years solving the same problem by putting a machine in the window and cooling one room at a time. While the machine dumps its waste heat into the street and makes the city hotter, so we buy a bigger machine. Meanwhile, architects are now going back to the tomb paintings at Thebes and studying the Malkaf because it turns out a hole in the roof pointed at the wind was a genuinely excellent idea and always has been. You will get warm today and you'll do something about it. Move to shade, drink something cold, sit near a fan, change what you're wearing, wait for the sun to drop. Small automatic adjustments you won't even register making. That's the same equipment, same species, same sweat glands, same 2% margin before the thinking starts going. The Egyptian in Thebes at noon in 1350 BCE was running the same calculation you run, with better architecture and worse beer. 3,000 years of the hottest place people chose to live, and the answer was never toughness. It was mud, linen, shade, salt, and paying attention. So could you do it? A summer in ancient Thebes, no fridge, no fan, roof for a bedroom, and a jar of warm beer for breakfast. Let me know in the comments. Until then, see